All right, so here's the thing we've been talking about recently. We've been talking a lot about arguing about word meanings. Now, it's important when we're looking at a tradition from another language. I should just stick to what I know. Hindu, Buddhist, Vedic Buddhist, right? From the Sanskrit, the Buddhist translated into the Pali. So here we are in English, and I've talked about this, and I never thought of giving this as an example. Here we are in English. We don't really understand the Asian culture, and we make a lot of assumptions, as do they. Now, the Asian language, Japan, China, they both use essentially the same characters. And as example here, before I've used the example of the character for heart. Chinese use the same character for heart and mind. And usually it's very convoluted in that case if you use that character as example and try to explain, say, for example, the Heart Sutra. Right? The character, if it means both heart and mind, it's kind of hard to get this idea across. Now, the Chinese will say, when we say heart, we know it means mind, but what about if you're talking about mind? Like in Buddhism, when we're talking about the chitta, the mind, the ear consciousness, or whatever, like when you specifically want to separate that, so that becomes pretty difficult. They say, oh, it works, right? Because we understand. How do you understand? And I'll give you an example. There's a YouTube channel that we like to watch, and I guess I'll be giving free kudos to them, and they're cool. The name of the channel is Tabi Eats. So you look at the word tabi is Japanese, and it means travel or journey. Now, it is true that you can infer quite a bit from that. So they're a food channel. They don't do strictly travel, but they do a lot of travel. They go around to different destinations, even different countries now. They eat street food, but they also eat stuff at home. So, in this case, you could see it as Tabi Eats journey with us as we eat, or journey with us as we explore food, travel with us, as in the experience as a journey or as travel. Or it could be referring to, like I said, the journey of the travel as they're exploring foods in their own country or in other countries. But it could also mean, the journey or the travel as in street food, right? Because you have the Japanese word onsen, which is commonly used for hot springs. But on actually means warm or temperature, and sun means fountain or spring. So, right, they'll say, well, yeah, onsen, it's a hot spring, or tabi eats means journey eats or travel eats. Like you assume the understanding, the meaning, right? But what if you assume the wrong meaning, right? So if you were to say to me, oh, onsen, and then I think, what, a temperature fountain? What's a temperature fountain? Right? and it's easy to say, well, it will know the meaning, but when you're talking about heart and mind, jing, sure, jing, it gets confusing. It really does, right? And the reason why I mention this is, what was the words we were just talking about? The other word. Oh, yes. We get stuck, particularly here in English. And I think this is really maybe the crux of the Western issue with translations. So in the West, English, arguably they say it's become a very lazy language. And I'll give you an example. I used the word respite yesterday. And just out of interest, I've been doing this lately. I've been checking the definitions, because what I've noticed is Google will give someone a couple definitions for a word, but we all know that there's many, many more meanings. And what I've come to realize, unless you click the little down arrow and expose the etymology, or I don't know what it is, that word, the root of a word, and look at, say, for if it comes from Latin or it comes from French, and you get a true understanding of what it means. Now, respite, when I read it, it was like the definition didn't apply, because I was using it in the sense of shelter from the storm sort of idea. Second or third definition down. So what I'm getting at here is in English, we seem to have stepped away from multiple meanings in words, and therefore we're losing this ability to share these complex ideas, right? So like I say, with mind and heart, it is true if you're a Chinese person and you do understand that heart means mind and mind it is referred to as heart. Same as the onsen, well, it's a hot springs, right? I mean, if you were to use it in a different word, it would mean, a warm fountain, or I don't know, you know what I mean. I mean, so it does make sense. So arguably, the problem may not be these other languages are too vague in their intended meaning. It could be that English itself is too plat, as we would say in French, too boring, too simple, too one-dimensional, too vapid, too shallow. So when you look at a word, multiple meanings, right? And here, I'll give you a lead up to what I've always used as an example and what I never thought of until recently and why I'm sharing. If you think the English word earth, okay? Earth is a great example, okay? Earth has multiple meanings still in the English language. And yes, there's a number of words that still do, but every word has multiple meanings that we miss. Earth can be the planet itself, okay? Earth can be dirt. Earth can be the ground under our feet. Earth can be home. Earth can be, a shelter, right? It can be both a noun or, you know what I mean. It's a thing, but it's also an idea, right? I mean, earth, you're down to earth, you're grounded, and that kind of idea. It's not talking about dirt or the planet, yet it's getting across the meaning, if you follow what I mean by that. So it has multiple meanings. And again, it is contextual. But so the example I use is the group of 7 painters painted this lovely windswept coast. And it was named Terre Sauvage. In French, the painter was not French, but he chose it, I think, because like the English word earth, that has multiple meanings, both terre and sauvage both have inherently have multiple meanings. So he named this painting, like I said, a windswept crag, very beautiful painting, and it at once looks wild and untouched, but also beautiful and what's the word I'm looking for? Like untouched, natural splendor sort of idea, right? So in French, terre sauvage, 2 separate words, obviously. Terre is the same as earth in a sense. It can mean dirt. It can mean the planet. But also it can have the same sort of meanings as it has in English, where, you're down to earth or you're the salt of the earth, right? That sort of idea, right? But it also, unlike in English, terre also can be your land. Remember how I said you can say back to earth very, very, very broadly. It can be considered a synonym for home, earth in English, but absolutely in French, terre would be your country, your continent, your planet, your home. Terre can also be like a place, right? Like where I'm going to situate myself, but neither here nor there. As I said, much, much deeper meanings on its own, but then when you go and add it together with the word sauvage, and it's not hard to infer what that is, savage. But in French, sauvage doesn't mean like we do. Savage now is a great example in English where we've lost a lot of the meanings. Savage had multiple meanings, not just the common ones today, where I guess the main meaning would be to ravage, right? To be unrestrained destruction, callous lack of restraint, that sort of idea, right? Destroying something without regard, right? Savage. It can also mean someone from, say, the deepest, darkest Africas, like from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, right? The savages, right? Or the settlers coming to North America, right? The settlers would see these wild Indians as savages, right? Or barbarians, right? The Romans coming into Gaul and seeing these wild, naked savages. Barbarians could be a great synonym in English. But it doesn't go much deeper than that anymore. Whereas savage can also mean it's like, that idea of a barbarian savage, that it's not just like they don't have culture, but it's also they're untouched. I mean, the idea of these uncontacted tribes in South America or the Amazon, calling them savage doesn't necessarily mean they will kill you. The idea was, they're wild, they're unkept, they live in their own, they're free. I mean, and that also, there's a discussion we've had. This fear of freedom itself might lead to this negative light cast on free peoples. Okay, but back to this terre sauvage, why he chose it. Because in French, the two words together mean much, much more than them individually. As I said, terre can be earth, it can be land, it can be the place you are. So it can be talking about, right, the land, because the painting is of land. But it's not. The idea is terre sauvage. So as I said, terre can be earth, but it can also be land. It can also be this place, all of this place. Kind of like in the Buddhist perspective, Dharma. Dharma is the teachings, Dharma is things, Dharma is all. It's the emotions, it's the environment. It can be everything. So same as this, terre sauvage. He's talking about not just the painting, not just that one idea, but he could be even talking about the wildness inherent in us all. It can mean this wild, dangerous land, but it can also mean this beautiful splendor, this natural beauty. At the same time, it can mean this untouched, perfection, but it can also be this savage, as in, the wind's blowing and the elements are raw, and you know what I mean? It could at once mean how horrible and exposed you'd be in this environment, but at the same time how free and unfettered you would feel within this same painting. So this idea of terre sauvage, the combination of the two words, brings about this much, much, much deeper understanding of what was trying to be portrayed, what was trying to be the message that was looking to be delivered in the painting. Again, paintings, they can be very... the meanings can be individual, obviously. But in this case, I mean, I think it's kind of obvious. It's, this lone little pine tree on a little point, a little hill in the middle of a lake, and you could tell the poor thing had been battered by winds since its birth. It looked kind of stunted, kind of like a little Charlie Brown tree. If you see in that the sadness, you can also see in it the hope, right? So this little pine tree that's been struggling to grow on this rock, right? So it has very little soil. I mean, it's fighting at all the odds, right? And it's succeeding. So, but you at the same time can see this lone little tree on this rock island, fighting the wind and the elements, and the lack of the soil. I mean, its environment is harsh. There's another English word that we have to use where this French title just automatically brings across, right? Terre sauvage. It's a given that's what he's talking about. This harsh environment, this harsh environment. But the meaning, again, could be the same here, right? The idea that you see more to it, right? You can see that lone little tree as, oh, that poor little thing struggling and failing. But at the same time, you could see it as the poor lone little tree struggling and succeeding against all odds, right? So once again, I go back and here's my bias as an English speaker. I've always thought that the failing was in these other languages. But I guess, that's what we're trying to overcome here. We're trying to overcome our own ignorance, our own prejudices. You make assumptions. So here I made some weird assumptions. I understood that Sanskrit and Pali are very recently I've learned that these words have multiple meanings. So why wouldn't we want to use words that have multiple meanings? I don't know. Sorry, I'm just trying to put together what I mean here. It's just simply that for a long time I thought the problem was in these other languages that didn't have a clear meaning. Yet I understood that. Like the Asian languages, I would deride the Japanese or the Chinese and say, well, you're not specifically saying what you mean. It's a failing in the translations from the Sanskrit or the Pali. Now, they didn't translate from the Pali, mainly from the Sanskrit, if exclusively, I believe. So let's just say Sanskrit. So I understand that Sanskrit can have multiple meanings. Whoa, no, I didn't understand that till recently. That's probably what caught me up there. For a long time, because I ran into that recently, I mentioned to someone that karma is action, same as dharma, because somebody actually asked me that. I was talking about dharma, talking about how it's, right, both the teachings, but it's also, things, and it can have more meaning. And this one gentleman said, oh my God, thanks for saying that. I said, I've been confused for this longest time, seeing this word dharma over and over again, and not really understanding its I guess you could call it like a complex word or a compound. Is it a compound word? Or I don't know. It has multiple meanings, which I should have realized when he mentioned that English is not naturally predisposed to assume there's multiple meanings in this. So even myself, even with my French background and understanding that Sanskrit can have multiple meanings, it still took me a while to realize this. And really what it was, I guess, was a combination of I guess the heart and mind in the Japanese, and then the tabi in Japanese, even the onsen in Japanese made me realize it's not the failings of the meanings in those languages, it's the fact that English itself has actually lost its complex words, meanings that depend on the context, right? So like in this case, yeah. When we argue about something as simple as emptiness, right? Shunyata. That's why I really enjoy the original words. And I think I've even found the perfect word for what we're working on here. Mindfulness is the common word they choose in the West. Emptiness, both of which don't really get across the complete message. So, when a teacher ends up trying to talk about shunyata, they spend more time trying to explain that, well, when I say empty, in emptiness, I don't mean empty, right? That's why I like to say when it says empty, they mean empty of inherent value or inherent existence. So really talk about oneness, because at the root of the meaning of emptiness, they always end up saying everything's connected, right? Nothing is independent, right? So the same can be said for what was the other word I was mentioning? I said emptiness and, well, karma was the one that recently I ran into. In Buddhism, they like to consider it in a very simple way because it's, again, a complicated subject. I really like the idea of going back to Sanskrit and understanding that, yeah, there's multiple meanings behind karma. It can be, yes, in the Buddhist perspective, it can be the outcome of your actions, but it becomes confusing to a Westerner when you say that, but don't explain how karma itself also means action, right? But what I was getting at is the English word mindful it's not just confusing like karma, it's even become arguably hurtful because we talk about something like be mindful on your breath. All you're doing is concentrating on this realm when really you should be concentrating on the middle, meaning not this place completely, not nothing completely, but the in-between, right? Contemplating the oneness of everything, meaning nothing is independent, so you don't focus on your breath because it's not independent from everything else. So it's not going to, well, you know what I mean? If you focus on it too much, the teachings is focus and calmness, right? So that's why I like that term, satipatthana. Satipatthana is a compound word, which is discussing the idea of focusing on one's breath. But I like satipatthana because if you are forced to go back and look at the meaning of the word, you'll actually end up seeing that it's much more complicated, and arguably English is the bottleneck here. Okay, because satipatthana, if we translate it to English, I see a lot of people say mindfulness of breathing. Okay, well, that's fine. But once again, you're making the mistake if you're trying to limit what you're being mindful of, right? Because here's what I see on that. I absolutely use essentially a modified version of satipatthana. But what I do is I focus on my breathing. Pranayama is where it came from, as we all should, but not too much. So I focus on my breathing in the sense that if I start to get distracted or I need to calm, you bring your focus back to your breathing. You bring your focus back to your breathing for calmness, for focus. Plus, you want to make sure you're actually doing it well and proper. Right? Satipatthana. Because the idea is not to focus on the breath, but to be aware. Awareness is a better idea, right? Not attention. I like to say that wisdom or understanding, clear light understanding, or what we tend to translate as satori, samadhi, or enlightenment or this understanding, this wisdom that we're all striving to achieve, is actually awareness. Because when attention ends, awareness begins. Do you follow me here? So that's why I say mindfulness is kind of a trope now, in the sense that if you tell someone to be mindful of their breathing, then we tend to forget that you're not just focusing on a cup of tea, because you're focusing on the cup of tea being guided by the Four Noble Truths, the three marks of existence, and the Eightfold Path. Now, that's not some cast-in-stone dogma. It's simply realizing that nothing lasts. Everything is either being born or is dissolving. Our suffering is caused by our own attachment to this ego, this self we're all obsessed with. And the end of that suffering is just living correctly. That's it. That's what you're guided by. You get right actions. When you think about, is this ego that's driving this wish? Is this selfishness that's making me want to do this? Can I balance what I need with what's best for everyone else? That sort of idea. When you balance all of those. And you're mindful of your actions and your choices. That's the practice, right? So when we end up arguing about the meanings of different words, same as the story, okay? If we all remember, the Buddha was asked to discourse on the philosophy with a Vedic scholar. And Shakyamuni, as the story goes, ended up just asking this Vedic scholar, what is most important? Is it being a scholar of Vedic tomes, meaning should I memorize as many sutras as you can, right? Is it perfection in ritual? Is it wearing the right robes? Or I'm adding that, but it's not uncommon. Is it, performing the right rituals to the right statue even? The outcome and the agreement on both sides was that no, absolutely the most important is action, is good deeds, right? And arguably that was taken directly from the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna, the avatar of Vishnu, the creator of the universe, Krishna, who gives that spark to all beings, that Atman in the Hindu tradition, Atman being the self in the Buddhist tradition, Krishna speaking to Arjuna, right, being at the heart of all beings. So you could see in this case Krishna as Buddha, so trying to explain to us our inherent nature. So the question that Arjuna asks Krishna is, what is best? Is it to sit and meditate and do nothing, right? I'm adding that, but he simply asked Krishna, of all the different ways, I don't want to say yoga, because that's the word they use, all the different practices, because that's what we're looking at. One of the yogas is meditation, as we call it. Mindfulness is another. So is the movement idea, but most of that in the modern day is hatha yoga. But Arjuna asks and says, well, what is the best path? Because again, we can't follow all of the paths. We can only do our best. So Krishna tells Arjuna that it's action, karma, karmic yoga. So as I said in the discussion between Buddha and the Vedic scholar, when asked to truly drill down and figure out what the most important of all the tenets, the most important that someone can do, can they perform the perfect rituals? Can they chant the perfect chants? Can they copy the sutras perfectly? Can they recite the sutras perfectly? Can they memorize more sutras than the next person? No. In the end, it was agreed that action itself is what's most important in life, right? So once again, we're missing the point. If we spend all day just arguing about what the words mean, we're just indulging in suffering, if not ego. Because if your goal is a deeper understanding of the meaning, then you'll be looking for a deeper understanding of the meaning. You're not going to argue about which is better or which isn't. I mean, arguably, that's what I love about what I thought I hated. The fact that most languages come with it multiple meanings, right? And yet, here I was deriding these Eastern languages for not being quite clear enough. So, leads back to my point. I'm in the shower. I know that's terrible to say, but in the shower, and I come to realize that I'm certainly not going to be learning Buddhism via Chinese. Because not only would you have to learn Chinese, the culture. I mean, you'll spend a lifetime, and will you really get the understanding? So here is this desperate need for a translation to the West, and why so many of us, I think, are going back to the Sanskrit and the Pali, because I'd rather get my meanings from there, particularly since the multiple meanings haven't been lost. Right? When it comes to Sanskrit and Pali, we can certainly much more easily find, for example, Satipatthana has about 6 different definitions, and don't quote me on that, but it's not uncommon. I can't remember if it's that word or another. It might be 6, might be 7, but it might even be as low as 3. But again, if you break that word up, it's made of 3 separate words, and each one of those have multiple meanings in Sanskrit. So what is really needed is a deeper understanding of each and every word. So I think that's why arguably we should be sticking to our own language. And why when we're using, I like using certain words from their original, like shunyata for the emptiness doctrine, because I don't really think emptiness gets the idea across. Using the word shunyata avoids the argument of emptiness versus oneness versus empty but not empty. But really, what's the point here? My point is, not only did I realize that in English we don't have this depth of meaning and understanding to each and every word, but more importantly, we're all being deluded or confused or even just indulging in arguing over the words rather than the meanings. Because, and here's, I don't know, my final thought on this, because can't get much more off topic, but where this flows from is the belief that the first individuals introduced Buddhism that said may have been the correct path. Because as the Buddha himself said, don't take everything he says as gospel, right? You have to question everything, even his teachings. So if we're following the lineage that just accepted his teachings verbatim and arguably have argued over what he meant and even created divisions and maybe even harm because of a disagreement over something as simple as, how many robes should you wear? I think one of the stories was, should you accept new fabric for a robe, because the teaching said that you should only use worn and worthless fabric to make yourself a robe. Again, missing the point here. The idea wasn't to wear a ripped and torn and tattered robe. It was an idea of being separate from this class system, right? It's like, well, my robe is nicer than yours. It was separate from that value idea. Like, you have to understand at the time the amount of fabric it would have taken to create a robe. That would have cost a lot of money to come up with that much material to produce a monastic robe. So to get all caught up in this idea, we're kind of missing the point. And what I mean by that is we're all arguing about the meaning of a specific word instead of the message that was meant, right? So when these monks are arguing about whether or not to accept some nice, pretty fabric for a robe, and never once discussing the fact that the actual teachings is about not attaching and not developing kind of a class system, right? If you can wear the new robe and not feel different than someone wearing an old robe. That's the point, right? So in this case, the point is that we learn from the teachings and not get mired in the argument of what word might be better. I mean, I see this constantly, right? When I share, recently I shared an alternate translation or interpretation of anicca, anatta, and dukkha. So alternate translations for impermanence, non-self, and suffering. So suffering is not an uncommon alternate translation. That's been around for a while, that some people are saying it's not so much it's not so much suffering as that it's just disappointing, right? Life is inherently dissatisfying. Okay, now the root of that is our desire. Now that also has become something of a point of contention. And what we mean by that, and this is where I think this new translation for anicca and anatta comes in. So the idea is all three marks of existence, the impermanence, as we've come to translate anicca, anatta, the non-self, right? And then dukkha, right? Suffering. So suffering was actually a potter's wheel. If the potter's wheel was set up imbalanced, not only would that be violent when it turned, you would be almost, you'd be hard-pressed to try to produce anything with that wheel. So there's where that idea is. And what that is supposed to tie into the non-self and the impermanence, it's actually all connected, same as all of this teachings. So the new translation is anicca is not impermanence. Anicca is that anything we strive for to satisfy our ego, anything desire-based, is inherently impermanent. Anything you desire, like, oh, I want to look pretty, or I want to have the prettiest robe even, that is absolutely impermanent, because that prettiest robe will only be pretty till it's stained or torn or worn out. And the same as non-self. That ties into it as well. You have to get away from that ego, because there is no Atman. There is no self. That is the delusion that we're all keeping ourselves from realizing our own inherent Buddha nature, our Tathagata Garbha. And that's all tied into each other, right? So the new translation of anicca is not so much impermanence. It's actually, once again, deeper than that. It's the impermanence of everything that is desire-based, ego-based. It is the inherent emptiness, the inherent wasted time, striving to satisfy these ego desires, these selfish, these vapid wishes and wants, right? Satisfying need arguably doesn't, well, there's a great way to look at that. So want and need. We talk about that a lot in the West, okay? Want, as in, this is what I want. The definition for a Westerner is you desire this, as opposed to need. Need is you must have. It's a requirement, okay? So when you look at this from the Buddhist perspective, wanting something is purely an ego-based wish, okay? Need can be a deluded ego-based, right? Because how many people will say, well, I need a new pair of shoes? Well, because somebody else has a new pair of shoes, or they want to keep up with the new fashion, right? As opposed to, I need a new pair of shoes because I have holes in my shoes. That is a need, right? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about using the Four Noble Truths, the Three Marks of Existence, and the Noble Eightfold Path to guide everything you do. So when it comes to discussing the meaning of a word, you definitely have to have right intention. Why are you talking about the meaning of this word? Is it to get a deeper understanding, to fulfill this need, or is it a sincere wish to better your practice? Is it an attempt to share an understanding with somebody else? Or is it simply to shout someone down? Or is it to support your own delusion that you think this is what it means and you don't want to be challenged in any other way? I mean, arguably, we've talked about this. It should never become easy. It should always be a challenge, right? Because we're constantly fighting this ego, this entity that is constantly trying to pull the wool over our eyes to the real nature of our dissatisfaction in life, right? That's why the translations of these words need to be understood in a multi-leveled, multi-layered, like a millefeuille, right? 1,000 layers to these things, right? Because when we look at anicca, impermanence, you need to understand that, yes, everything's impermanent, but not everything, because impermanence is guaranteed, except for your Buddha nature, which is intrinsic. So not everything is. But when we get away from that confusion of the definition of impermanence and look at anything desire or ego-based, any satisfaction of your ego or your desire, any endeavor that's based in that delusion is inherently dissatisfying, right? Because, again, we're going to say it's not so much the non-self, it's the fact that there is no self. So, I mean, it's not the matter of destroy your ego, as is commonly discussed. That's impossible. What I say is a common trope in the West in self-help circles. It begins with just realizing that is the source, the root of your suffering, right? When you come to realize that anatta is not so much non-self in that there is no self. That ego root is the cause of your suffering, is the thing that's keeping you deluded, and it is your enemy. It is the thing you're fighting, and it is the thing that you're threatening. So that deeper understanding makes you understand that it's not about ego death, as many entheogenic psychonauts will say. It's not an ego death. It's an ego awareness. It's an awareness that you don't put your attention to the self, because the self is a delusion. It's a manifestation of this mind that we can't see or show. The self, the Atman in the Buddhist teachings, is a creation that keeps us trapped in this cycle of birth and death and rebirth. Keeps us trapped in this cycle of, I'd say, recycling, right? So don't think of a rebirth. I like to say recycling, energy recycling, right? If you go through this life dissatisfied, constantly being disappointed, you're surrounding yourselves with negative energy. When the time comes to recycle, as the Tibetans say, the Bardo Thadul, the in-between states, when that time comes, if you're attaching to negative energy, that's how you'll be recycled. And our goal is not to be reborn as a self, anatta, the non-self. The goal is to realize that is a delusion. That ego is not reborn. That ego doesn't even exist. How can it be reborn? The only thing that is reborn is your delusions every time you indulge them, right? The only thing that's reborn are these chittas, these minds, these delusions, right? What we need to do is just watch them appear, right? Insight, vipassana, stay calm, shamatha, right? Rooted in the mindfulness of one's breath, satipatthana, meaning you're focusing on your breath, but not too much, so that you can see beyond this delusion, this self, this ego that keeps us trapped in this cycle of birth and rebirth, because the ego is afraid to be exposed for the imposter that it is. So we need to be guided by these simple truths, right? We need to understand that it's not the definitions, it's not the meanings themselves, it's the heart of the teachings of shunyata, right? There is no form without emptiness, there is no emptiness without form, there is no dharma, there is no attainment. The goal is the path. There is no destination, it is a journey. Okay? And upon that journey, we always must be guided by those simple principles. So when you're talking about the meaning of a word, you should be guided by the fact, forget ego, right? That doesn't even exist. Forget trying to satisfy any desires that stem from ego or desire, because that is a waste of time. Suffering from that is guaranteed, right? Well, we like to say pain from that is guaranteed. The suffering is optional, but you know what I mean. So when it comes down to you simply discussing the meaning of a word, you should never, ever get distracted by a challenge to your understanding. You should embrace that, because at the heart of what we're doing here is to realize we're all deluded in our understanding of everything. So how could you be sure of the meaning of something that you yourself don't completely understand? And more specifically, how can we understand the meaning of anything when none of it can be explained in words? That sounds like a weird little thing, but it's true. If we're talking about the true nature of reality lies outside of our experiential state, that means it is absolutely an impossibility for us to experience it firsthand without stepping outside of that deluded state. So we live, I've said it before, in this super state, right? And we need to think in a supernormal way. My new favorite term. Supernormal as in we're always going to want to make the selfish choice. Our ego is going to scream at us that we must satisfy our own selfish desires. It's the realization that that is the root of our suffering. It's the realization that that doesn't exist. It's the realization that the dissatisfaction we all feel in life flows from this simple fact. It's the realization of these facts that allows us to achieve this peace, this betterment, allows us to walk this path. But more importantly, this will allow us to truly understand the intended meanings behind all of these teachings and not get mired in an argument over one word or another. So again, let's not get mired in what a word means or what it's intended to mean. Let's not get too obsessed over one culture or another, or one language or another. Let's be guided by the reason we're all doing this. A deeper understanding towards self-realization, cultivation, right? A wisdom, a knowledge, an understanding. I like the Tibetan translation of a clear light understanding, right? We don't accept one because there is no one definition, one translation. As the Buddha said, upaya, efficient means, right? There is no single path to entry to the Dharma of Nirvana. That was Churyi. So I'll leave this by saying practice never ends. That's the biggest thing I could share with everybody else. And everybody could use to better their practice. And that's the new path that we're on. I'm going to talk about this in future episodes of either this podcast or another. Looking to expand, get away from our own preconceived ideas of sect or practice and actually really try to implement some of these alternate ideas. I mean, for me, I was never much of a sitter, more of a, mindful in all actions. But we'll get to that. That would be another discussion about my own practice. I personally used a modified pranayama, which could be considered a satipatthana, mindfulness of breathing, in combination with a jikang, which could be considered, a very mild moving meditation, very early Tai Chi, or a very laid back yoga. I hesitate using the term yoga because there's another one that's gotten lost to history. Yoga, as I said, is just simply a practice, right? An option to take. So there you go. So there's my take on translation, but more importantly, how easy it is to be deluded by bias, right? Because here's me saying, oh, geez, I can't get anything out of the Chinese. Why do they even still, the Chinese and the Japanese still use these characters? Because, you can't even get your meaning across. And yet here I am. I speak both English and French, and firsthand already know that English doesn't have as deep meanings when it comes to their words, but the French absolutely still do. And yet, here I was deriding the Asian, the scripts, because they were the problem. And that here I'm thinking, well, they should change maybe their characters and they can get the meaning across. No, actually, I come to realize the beauty of language is in its ambiguity. Because I've come to realize, the only way that a human being can connect with another human being is via language, right? We've discussed this wordless Dharma transmission. I'm not a believer in it. I truly believe understanding, you can understand it yourself, but without any kind of, not duality, but without any basis of knowledge, right? If you never teach a kid, physics, they may not have a deeper understanding, right? It's not an uncommon thing today for people to not understand some basic things until you're taught, right? It's like Sherlock Holmes once said that he only concerned himself with knowledge that would help him solve crimes, which is the idea here. It's not a bad thing to not concern themselves with knowledge one does not need, right? But so here we are, and I'll have to cut the end of that because wow, it's rattled on, didn't it? Oh well, it's almost an hour. Not bad.